Welcome to Truth and Liberty. Thank you for joining our daily live call-in broadcast, where trusted leaders bring biblical insights to the issues, and you can call in and get your questions answered in real time. According to the Bible, it's the truth you know that sets you free. So call in today to get answers, information, and resources to help you stand for truth and effect godly change in our nation and the world. And now here's your host, Richard Harris.
Hello, everybody, and welcome to Truth and Liberty. I'm Richard Harris, your host for today's show, and just really excited about the program we have in store for you. I think it's going to be just educational and inspiring, and just excited about it. And I'll introduce our special guest in just a minute, but wanted to let everyone know that last weekend here on the campus of Andrew Womack Ministries and Charis Bible College, Truth and Liberty's annual conference was held, and it was really, really awesome. One for the books, truly. I tell you, we had a great attendance, great turnout. Dr. Ben Carson spoke on Friday night, Rick Green also, and so many others, including our guest today. And I believe the videos have been or soon will be loaded onto our website. So if you were not able to come and join us in person, be sure to watch the archive videos of the conference on our website at truthandliberty.net. I promise you this, you will be inspired, you will learn things that you did not know before, and you'll also be connected in these sessions with speakers and organizations that, I believe that God will connect you in a way that it'll be a heart connection, and you'll find a place where you can get involved and begin to increase your own effectiveness at taking America back for the Lord. So it was just awesome. Everything from the opening session and all the way through to Pastor Cheon's closing message on Saturday afternoon was phenomenal. So be sure to check those out. And you know how it is here at Andrew Womack Ministries. There's always something awesome going on, and we don't let the grass, we don't let much of it grow under our feet. The next event is next week, the Global Ministers Conference. Andrew has been doing a ministers conference for, 40 years. He used to do a little gathering out in Buena Vista, Colorado in the early days, but now it's become a major event. September 30th through October 4th, here again at the ministry, Andrew's going to be ministering along with Todd White, Billy Epperhart, Mike and Carrie Pickett, Pastor Dwayne Sheriff, Bob Yandian, Greg Moore, and Wendell Parr will all be speaking. And, if you're in full-time ministry or you want to be, this event, I tell you, will recharge you, will fire you up, motivate you, strengthen you. And it's a tough thing to be ministering in the last days, isn't it, right? And we all need to fellowship and stick together and make sure that our batteries are fully charged. You can register for this ministers conference on awmi.net/events, and you won't want to miss that. Also, we announced for the first time at the Truth and Liberty Conference that Charlie Kirk is coming to the campus here and is going to be speaking. The date is October 18th. We don't have graphics or anything ready yet. This is a recent development, but Charlie's going to come out on October 18th. It's a Friday night. It's a free event, and you won't want to miss it. The event begins at 7 p.m. It'll last probably till 9 or 9:30. But Charlie will be doing, and Andrew will be ministering as well. But Charlie will be speaking and then doing a live Q&A. So if you can make it out for this event in person, you absolutely want to do that. If you can't make it in person, then watch online. It will be live streamed on our website at truthandliberty.net. So make plans to catch that amazing event. And then October 31st to November 2nd, Andrew Womack's last Gospel Truth Conference ever. Now, he's been doing these for years and years, but his last one ever, his final GTC, is going to take place in Dallas, Texas, at the Renaissance Dallas Addison Hotel. And so check out the website, awmi.net/events, and you can find out more information, including how you can register and what the schedule is going to be. Imagine that, if you have a chance to come to Andrew's final GTC. Now, don't worry. Andrew is not retiring. He has just made the decision that his time is more effectively spent here at the campus, because we've been building out for months here a variety of different studios. I think we have 7, 8, maybe 9 studios now that are complete or nearly complete. And Andrew is able to reach far more people by recording and doing live broadcasts here at the studio than he is with the time and expense of traveling to these other locations. And so the decision has been made to use Andrew's time most effectively. He's now going to stop doing GTCs. And yeah, we're all a little bit sad about it, but if we focus in on the fruit that is going to be born for the kingdom of God, then it's easy to get excited. So, but his last GTC, Dallas, Texas, October 31st through November 2nd. If you're in the area and you want to come out and see Andrew live, as well as Jeremy Pearsons will be ministering with Andrew at this final GTC, then come on out, and it's a free event. You want to take advantage of that. Hey guys, I'm going to go ahead and announce it, that the Truth and Liberty website is receiving a full makeover. We don't have a date set of the new launch, but it's going to be really soon. So be watching your emails for announcements about the new Truth and Liberty website. We're going to have a brand new Watch Now center with all of our videos and archives for the past several years available. A resources center that is revamped and user-friendly in a way that is going to blow your mind. I promise you this, the Truth and Liberty Resource Center, I don't think there's anything like it anywhere in the country. You're going to be able to search simultaneously hundreds of links of articles, blog posts, training resources manual, America's founding documents, and many other things. There are strategic partners and lots of other things where you can say type in immigration or illegal immigration or abortion or the right to freedom of religion, and our website will pull up for you the most on-point articles and resources that you can find, and it's going to be absolutely powerful, and it's all designed to equip you to stand for truth in the public square. So be watching for that. All of our past episodes of Truth and Liberty will be archived there, so it's going to be awesome. Be watching for that. Okay, guys, so let me introduce to you our special guest today. Luke Ball has become a good friend of this ministry, of mine personally. He's a Republican strategist and the CEO of Mason Burrow Strategies. He's also a political commentator, a frequent guest on Victory News and Flashpoint. Prior to founding Mason Burrow Strategies, Luke has served as a congressional staffer, a deputy campaign manager, and deputy digital director. He served as a spokesman for President Trump's Save America rallies and has advised multiple congressional and gubernatorial political candidates. He received national attention from both sides of the aisle, even praise from the right and outrage from the left, from MSNBC labeling Luke's work as evidence of Republicans' historic anti-democratic assault on the country, to Tucker Carlson heralding his content as so good, and he's been picked up by Sky News and others. I tell you what, Luke is a brilliant guy, an up-and-coming Christian conservative who I think we all need to keep our eyes on. Luke, you just spoke at our conference. Thank you for coming out, and thank you for turning around and doing today's broadcast of Truth and Liberty with me. We really appreciate it.
Thank you for having me, Richard. I was so encouraged when I was on the campus by interacting with patriots and Christians and conservatives from all across Colorado and the nation, people who came in for this. And I think that the things that you guys are doing on campus are very special and unique among a lot of ministries.
Thank you, Luke. I really appreciate it. Your message was awesome. People have been talking to me about it for days. And the other thing is, I was so surprised when I asked for a show of hands of how many people were from outside the state of Colorado. And it was possibly a majority of the guests. So that's awesome. That means our reach is growing. And people were so excited about all the awesome speakers. So thanks for being a part of that.
Absolutely. It was really, really good. And if you guys continue growing, I think that the mainstream media is going to start pointing their arrows at you a lot more. So stand firm and keep doing exactly what you're up to.
Yeah, that's not very encouraging, Luke, but I'll forgive you for that. There's also already a lot of progressive and extremists out there who are trying to take us down with all the, the negative stuff and the lies. But, we really don't pay much attention to it because we're so busy just doing what God's called us to do. Luke, share with us and with our folks that are watching, if you would, just a little bit about how did you get involved in politics? I mean, you're a young guy, but you live in the DC area, and such connections. It's awesome. How did you get to where you are?
I stumbled into it. I was not anticipating that I'd have a career in politics. It was just an interest of mine. And then I was applying to a particular program in DC called the Youth Legislative Training Conference through an Association of American Christian Schools, where they flew high schoolers up to Washington, DC for a week to participate in a mock conference and interact with members of Congress and do tours of Capitol Hill and the monuments. And then we would go back and have these sessions where we would debate this mock legislation, and we would write our own bills. We'd propose them. We'd learn how to argue particular talking points, and we'd represent a member of the U.S. Senate. And for this period of time, I was Rand Paul. And although some of the people were disgruntled about it, they were assigned Democrat roles. And I had a couple students this past year come up to me and say, how do you even argue as a Democrat? And I'm like, well, if you put yourself into that mindset, you might start to understand just sort of the ridiculous arguments that they have to come up with to justify their positions. And so we had this sort of theatrical role to play back and forth, and it allowed us to understand each side and also the mechanics of how the U.S. Senate operates. And so I went to college down in Florida, and I was getting a degree in criminal justice, which I've utilized actually in legislation on Capitol Hill before. It was not entirely unuseful whatsoever, but I realized that my minor, which was political science, was going to end up playing a larger role once I started volunteering and interning for things like the congressional office or Senate races. Marco Rubio was running for re-election, so I jumped on that for the Senate race down in Florida. And I realized that there could be a path here for a career field, which soon I realized was more of a mission field. Once I got up to Washington, D.C., started seeing how that town operated and just sort of the mechanics of the operations, I realized that it's very easy for people who come up with very good intentions to get distracted from the reasons that they came up. And one of the reasons it's so easy to get distracted is if it becomes your home and your culture, it becomes your identity, and you forget the people that you promised you would come up and represent. You forget all of the promises you made on the campaign trail, and you solidify your incumbency by serving in Washington for basically as long as you want. If you can get through the first 2-3 elections and build up a war chest, then you can stay in that town for as long as the legal limit is, which as of right now, there is no limit. That's why I think we need things like term limits to ensure that people remember why they came up to that town and don't just get sucked into the culture. But that's all beside the point. But I came up and started working there, started climbing the hill, and then became involved in the Trump Save America PAC cycle during the 2022 midterms, flew around the country filming him and doing a lot of his social media. And I found myself back in Washington, D.C., and I've settled down and I'm married. And so I started my business here to give me a little bit more flexibility and to be able to work for a lot of other members of Congress and do media and be able to come on and talk to Christians like those who are watching this program to make sure they are fully knowledgeable about how this town operates.
That there's so much you said in there that I could go different directions with, but I want to kind of zero in on it being a mission field, Luke. A lot of Christians have heard throughout their walk with the Lord in church and different things. Well, politics is dirty, stay out of that. We don't want to go there. That's dirty. I'm not sure how we're supposed to shine the light for the lost if we don't go into the dark places. And, Bill Federer in his message in our conference was talking about this mindset of two kingdoms. You got the kingdom of this world and the kingdom of God, and the two don't touch. But obviously you don't share that perspective. Yours is more of I need to go in there where the darkness is so we can share the perspective of the kingdom of God on these things.
Absolutely. And Bill was just texting me before the program. And so I think he's got a solid foundation. When I'm looking at this battle and when people are looking at politics and they see this darkness, there is darkness there. However, there are people, there are souls, there are lost folks who are involved in the sphere who would never see a testimony or a witness or hear anything about the gospel or any sort of even just basic surface level policy differences if Christians weren't involved in that sphere. If we retreated from this battle, then the world has just completely stepped in and taken over, and the evil one has run rampant. Our charge and our calls to stand against the dark dark forces of evil. And we recognize that a lot of these things that are happening in our culture are outpourings of a spiritual battle, a lot of which takes place in the politics of the federal government, but then percolates down to the state and local governments themselves. So if Christians take a step back from it and don't get involved at all, then you start to see ramifications like the things we see today. And I think, unfortunately, it's because people for too long have decided that they're not going to be engaged in the culture battles. They're not going to be engaged in these fights, either because they don't know how to do it, or it scares them, or they're unaware of the consequences of being uninvolved would retain, anything like that. And so the symptoms that we get so upset about right now are a direct outpouring of the actions that we either did or did not take 5, 10, 15 years ago. And if we want to see a culture that is redeemed and a nation that's brought back to Christ, then we're going to have to be speaking up and standing out in these public spaces. I mean, Jesus Christ said that if the world hated me, it'll also hate you. That goes down to the very core of everything that we believe that's founded in our worldview. The outpouring of our worldview is going to go countercultural to the world. And so that natural pressure of buttressing up against people who are saying that you shouldn't be involved in government, you shouldn't be speaking out, your faith should remain in the church buildings, that is a symptom of people who for too long have not been speaking out and standing up. And the world's like, we've put you in this box for so long, you might as well just stay in there.
Yeah, I'm telling you, if you look at where we are as a country, I think you can trace it directly to the failure of Christians to engage the culture. And, I remember when I got born again and coming up in a church, and it was an awesome church. I mean, we were winning the lost and doing all this stuff, and it was great. But I also remember hearing preaching along the lines of, don't go to movies, that's sinful. Don't get involved in politics, that's dirty. You don't need no fancy education, you just need to trust in God, and all these kinds of things, which on the surface might sound holy and religious, but when you dig down a little deeper, it's really contrary to the example that Christ gave us, for one thing, and the commandment to go into all the world and make disciples of all nations. So, yeah.
Sometimes sanctified opinions make for bad theology if it's not founded on actual truth. If you just designate that this is what I think in my head should be the actual case, if you can't back it up with anything in Scripture, then you're probably left hanging with an opinion that's not valid.
Well, we made a lot of progress, it seems like, over the last few years with getting some pretty good people in Congress. But you're right there rubbing elbows with these men and women, and I'm curious what your perspective is. Do the Christians that are serving in Congress, do they really feel supported by the Christian community, or do they feel sort of abandoned and thrown to the wolves, or is it somewhere in between?
Unfortunately, we have, as you know, in Congress, people who say that they're Christian, first of all, and then their life does not bear any fruit of that claim. You've heard of Republicans in name only, rhinos. Well, there's Christians in name only too, unfortunately. And you could look at the fruit or outpouring of their policy decisions or the things that they say or the company that they keep as close friends as opposed to people they're trying to minister to, and make some sort of a determination as to where they stand on these biblical truths. And the real Christians in DC make sure they have a foundation of partners that come alongside them. This cord of 3 strands, or this bushel that's not easily broken, that is crucial and essential up here in this town, because if you get separated and clean from the herd, then you're going to get taken out by the world and the influence of politics in DC. So when these real Christians who are coming up to DC and retain their faith and don't lose sight, go back to their constituencies or go back and attend conferences like the one that we just had with Truth and Liberty, they are encouraged by the outpouring of support from patriots who see the symptoms of this culture war being lost oftentimes and say, how can I get involved and how can I support you? I'm not an elected official, I'm not a member of Congress, and yet people will come up to me and say, we love what you're doing, we love how you're speaking out, and we want to support you. So it's easy for members to fade into the background, to just be these backbenchers, to be the ones that do everything that the leadership in the House of Representatives or the Senate tells them to do. They can have a very cushy and easy life of no consequence. The ones that do stand on their principles and refuse to be shaken by the things of this world are the ones that normally come under a lot of scrutiny, not just from political battles, but also from these large institutions institutions in our federal government, like the Department of Justice and like the FBI and some of these other entities, because far too often those entities are an outpouring or another arm of the Democrat Party, this entrenched establishment liberalism in Washington, D.C. Look, that town is like 75 to 80%, if not more, Democrat. In fact, the last time I checked in a particular district, it's like 90%. And so when you have these people who are 90% Democrat staffing all of the positions in the Department of Justice, staffing all the positions in these bureaucracies in the federal government, and then we have things like a pandemic and wonder why on earth we have bad policy and oppressive, tyrannical policies pouring out of our federal government, and why the lawfare against people like President Trump or some of these J6 defendants or a lot of other conservatives are coming out of these entities. Look no further than to who's staffing these places. And so the Christians and the Republicans and the conservatives and all of those who are in this town are not welcome ever. And so it is my goal to be involved in institutions in Washington, D.C. that create homes for these people and give them a solid foundation and a base while they're in this town. And then when they go home to their constituencies and their other organizations, they are reminded of why they come up to this town and fight every day and get a refreshment from the people who are supporting them.
You know, this whole thing about there being a deep state, just based on your last comment, I take it the deep state you think really is true. I mean, it does exist, right? Well, how did it get that way? I think Dems and liberals are naturally drawn to government more than they are, say, to some other fields like, other business endeavors. But, but for it to be 90%, 90% Democrats, employees of the federal government, is it that way on purpose? In other words, have the Democrats, has the Democrat presidents and others been smarter than us? Have they intentionally staffed the federal government with hard left supporters and things like that?
I think that's part of it. The policy battle is a major issue in Washington. We say personnel is policy, not just in congressional offices, but across all facets of the federal government. I'd also say this too. Anytime that a liberal looks at a problem, their solution to that problem is normally more government or more education.
Yeah, absolutely.
And so when they value these institutions way over any sort of family or church or faith, then you start to see from our institutions more and more liberals who go in and make bad policy decisions in our government. And if we have to look at where this sort of bad policy is coming from, even just immediately out of the gate, well, look no further than our institutions that are propping up Hamas terrorists and tolerating these people, these protesters who are sitting on campuses and supporting the terrorists. And these are college students who are highly impressionable, who sit under these very liberal, predominantly woke college professors. I believe that the last statistic showed that it was about 85% of them were liberal and not conservative. They generally don't give conservatives tenure or these positions in these colleges. And so when you place that high emphasis, it becomes that standard that you basically have to graduate from a poison ivy, as I call it, college in the United States of America in order to get a very cushy federal job that generally has an enormous amount of benefits, and it's very hard to fire you because a lot of people just hire you and forget about you because taxpayer money's taking care of it. It's not hurting anybody else who's these people's bosses. And over time, you have this outpouring of bad staffing and entrenched bureaucrats. And so when we talk about draining the swamp, as I made a presentation at the conference, the element that I was discussing was the lobbying in that town and how they wrote members of Congress in and things of that nature. That's an outpouring of Capitol Hill. But another component of the swamp are these 20, 30, 40, 50-year bureaucrats that have sat around in the same position, getting an increase in salary all the time, that are behind the curtain and behind the scenes, that make policy decisions and then don't get the scrutiny from others because they're just these no-name individuals who hide behind their different departments. So that has to be drained. And that's another thing that Trump has promised that he would do if he were reelected. It's something that I believe all Republicans should be supportive of, going in and making sure that we can root out the root causes of bad policy that comes out.
Well, we've got just a few minutes left in this segment. Luke, let me just, a lot of people may not know this, but in the federal government, there are there are political appointees, and then there are civil servants, or in other words, people that are protected by the Civil Service Act. In other words, they can't be hired or fired just purely for political reasons. How difficult is it if even the civil service ranks have been stacked with hardcore Democrat operatives? How hard is it going to be for Donald Trump to drain the swamp?
Well, you'd have to go in and change that. You'd have to change that protection that they enjoy that gives them a license to utilize their political agenda behind that cloak of incumbency. So the intention that they said it would do was that it would make sure that they're not rooted out every time the administration changes over. But what happens is that the people who are predominantly in these positions are predominantly liberal, and therefore it entrenches their political position at the behest of, the federal government. And nobody can go in there and hold them accountable. They're just solidified behind all of these laws and policy and legislation, and they can rule from their ivory towers without any sort of oversight. And then when we try to investigate them, when we try to look into the policies that they've made, then they hide behind all of their different bulwarks and their walls, and they won't give us any sort of information. It's why we have to have these hearings where Rand Paul sits there and tries to drill down on Anthony Fauci and ask him these questions that he refuses to answer and won't release transcripts of his meetings and things of that nature. They're hiding behind all of the bad policies and legislation that they have created in order to deceive the American people.
Well, one thing's for sure, that if Kamala Harris wins, that this situation's going to get worse, not better.
Yes.
But at least if Trump wins, he's going to take a stab at it and may make some progress. Well, Luke, let me ask you this. What do you think is the number one and number two issue right now that's going to drive the presidential election?
Number one issue is probably going to be abortion, because it's what the Democrats want to latch onto and push in front of the constituents that they know are going to turn out for that. And unfortunately, Republicans have been a very poor arguer on behalf of the unborn because they've not had good communication skills, or they have not had a reason or an answer for why they believe what they believe. And I won't go into it now as we're winding down time on the segment, but I have a very short pitch that I gave in a presentation at the conference called the SLED argument, which just goes through some of the reasons. And when you propose these reasons, then the other side is stumped. They're not able to articulate their viewpoint. And so we as Christians have to do a better job of arguing that point. And then second, it just comes down to the economy, because you can't give the American people stats and numbers and tell them the economy is doing well. They have to feel it in their hearts. And that was something that James Carville, who was Bill Clinton's advisor, said just a few weeks ago. So I think those are going to be the top two issues. Of course, the border and immigration and law and order is important. But as we're looking at the polls, I think that those are the two messages that the different campaigns are going to be honing in on. And it is important for Christians to understand the ramifications of the policy proposals that each side has.
Yeah, absolutely. All right, well, let's go ahead and take a break here, and we'll be right back. We're going to share some information with our viewers, and then we'll be right back in about 90 seconds with Luke Ball.
With Practical Government, you have experts in the fields that are sharing their perspective, wisdom, and experience. It's not available anywhere else in the world.
We're going to teach a Christian heritage of our American government. They're going to learn about the Founding Fathers. We're teaching the Constitution, how government operates, practical skills, and field study.
No matter where you're coming from, the world needs you.
Whatever God's calling you to do, you're able to do it.
To learn more, visit practicalgovernmentschool.com.
Hey, a big part of what we do here at Truth and Liberty is to provide you with the resources that you need in order to stand for truth in the public square. So I want to remind everybody to go to our website and check out our resources page at truthandliberty.net/resources, where you can find material that discusses just about every issue we're facing today in our culture. And these are things that are prepared by our strategic partners and some of the most influential and important organizations in America today. At Truth and Liberty Coalition, we have big plans to make a big impact. If you want to be a part of turning our nation back to God, I want to invite you to become a supporter of Truth and Liberty. You can go on our website at truthandliberty.net to the donate page and make a gift there. And you can also sign up to make a recurring automatic gift of $5 or more per month, and then you'll become a Truth and Liberty member. And our gifts to Truth and Liberty are not tax deductible, but I promise you, God sees your generosity. So go to Truth and Liberty and become a member today. All right, we're back here on Truth and Liberty. I'm Richard Harris, your host, and my guest today is Luke Ball, a political strategist and consultant, the CEO of Mason-Burrow Strategies, and a good friend of our ministry here. Luke, at the break, we started talking about what are the driving issues in this campaign, and you mentioned abortion and the economy. Just coming back to abortion for just a second, since Roe versus Wade, it seems like that we are still sort of in a boomerang effect, negative, as far as politics go from that decision. As so many people, I think moderates and liberals are scared that this so-called right of abortion is going to be destroyed and this kind of thing. And I agree with you 100% that we haven't, on the conservative side, we've run away from the issue instead of running to the roar, if you will, and standing our ground. It seemed to me that in the midterms, the last midterms in 22, that there were a handful of conservatives that did stand their ground and articulated a defense of the right to life, and they seemed to do just fine. It was the moderates those labeled conservatives who didn't defend their stance that got hammered. Am I right on that, and is that still the environment we're in?
You are correct. And I discussed this a little bit during the conference, but I think that the solution to this problem is largely an education of the constituency. Mm-hmm. And when we're talking about having solid foundations for these members of Congress to actually go in and vote their conscience and vote their beliefs, that is going to be the only thing that changes the direction of policy and legislation. Because you saw things happen in the midterms that we weren't pleased with as a result of the left using this as a wedge issue and turning out a lot of their voter base. There are millions and millions of Christians in the United States, not only that aren't turning out to vote, but aren't even registered to vote. And I believe that when you drill down on this issue, it is something of a single issue for me, honestly, that you start to unpack the reasons behind why this is such a hot topic. And unfortunately, the overwhelming majority of reasons people give for abortion are not legitimate. They'll say things like, what about the case of incest or rape or life of the mother? Well, the last time I looked at the statistics, the percentage of abortions that it comes down to related to that are somewhere in the ballpark of 1%. So if we could set aside the 1% briefly and focus on the 99%, I would pose to the Democrats and the liberals and ask them, could we have a discussion on the 99% after you set aside that one talking point that you love to use? What is your justification for abortion for those who aren't a result of the other 1%? Yeah. And they won't have a good argument. They'll always go back to that. They have argument by anecdote. You'll have things that come up in the news, these one-offs, these situations that are far out of left field that don't have application to the overarching issue, and yet they use that as the foundation for their argument. And so since we've been driven back to this, I'll expound a little bit on the reasons that I believe that abortion is wrong, and I won't even have to utilize scripture in order to do it. I love pointing back to scripture for it, but if you're debating somebody who is pro-abortion, they're probably not going to listen to you when you start utilizing Bible verses. You can get to that a little bit later. But to break down that stronghold that they have, I use a few simple arguments, and I didn't come up with this, but this is something that's widely used. It's called the sled argument. You first have to ask the question, what is the unborn? And once you define that, you essentially drill down to the fact that those who are inside the womb are just as human as those who are outside the womb. So SLED stands for size, level of development, environment, and dependability. On size, somebody that is 3 feet tall is no more or less of a human than someone who is 6 feet tall. So somebody who is inside the womb and very small should not be any more or less of a human than somebody who is outside the womb. The second one, level of development. Somebody who is 2 years old is not going to be as fully developed as somebody who is 32 years old, but it doesn't reduce their status as a human. So somebody who is inside the womb that has a smaller or lower level of development than a full-grown human does not reduce their status as a human. Size, level of development, environment. I said this in the conference, but when I got on a plane here in Washington, D.C. and flew over to Denver, Colorado and drove to Woodland Park, I became no more or less of a human than when I first got on that plane and took that hundreds and hundreds of miles into a different location and environment. So why would a few feet down a birth canal change somebody's status as a human being? And dependability is the last one. I have relatives who I love dearly who struggle with developmental issues, and they are highly dependent on their parents for support. They are highly dependent on the people who are surrounding them to help them sustain life. In addition, somebody who is just born, maybe just a month old or a few weeks old, is highly dependent upon the parents and their guardians for sustainability. Just because that person requires that does not mean that their status as a human has changed. But the Democrats would argue that in the few seconds in between when they're inside the mother and then outside the mother, the status as a human being changes. Unless you're the former governor of Virginia who argues that if the baby is born, then they can keep it warm and safe and comfortable for a little bit until they decide what to do with it. That was an actual policy position, and everybody lost their mind over that, even on the left sometimes, because it was a bad representation of communication from their side. But that's essentially what they're doing. They lost their mind over that, and yet if it had happened a few seconds earlier, they would have been totally fine with that. Do you see how ridiculous the other side is on this issue? And it's unfortunate that a large majority of people simply do not want to accept responsibility for their actions. And now I will caveat with this. There are people who are victims in this situation. But again, we are not talking about that 1%. We have isolated that and are discussing the 99%. And then the question becomes, if that person inside is a human, then when we're talking about this issue, do they have a right, just as a human that is in a different environment or that is different in that sled argument, to be killed inside the womb just because they are there? And the answer is absolutely no. They did nothing wrong. It is a violation of their constitutional right to life to be murdered inside of the womb. And so we have to change the argument in this nation, and we have to change the conscience of this nation if we actually want to see a change in policy.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, you know, in the Trump-Harris debate, I felt like Donald Trump did an exceptionally poor job of articulating a stance on abortion. He did push back a little bit, but you know, Kamala got away with calling first off Trump abortion bans, saying that late-term abortion does not occur in America, which is an absolute lie. Happens right here in Colorado every day. And around the nation. I mean, if you remember when the photos came into the news a few months back of the discarded remains at the Washington, D.C. abortion clinic,
yes,
and there were late-term babies in garbage bags. It was absolutely disgusting and horrifying. But the thing of it is that we need to stand for this issue. But Luke, let's move on because there's so much I want to ask you about. The second attempt to assassinate Donald Trump just unfolded over the last few days. Thank God no shots were fired by this crazy guy. But there's so many questions arising out of this. The first one is, you know, a lot of people are trying. It was amazing how fast the liberal media blamed Donald Trump for someone trying to kill him. I mean, how absurd is that? How do you compare the rhetoric coming from the left versus that coming from the right? Is it equally vitriolic, or is the left really more hateful?
Well, I've noticed that it's only the left that has been trying to kill Donald Trump in both of these circumstances. And now there's people who are on the left, who are on the right, who will sometimes be completely outlandish and do ridiculous things. But the left will accuse the right of being people who are hateful, who spew hateful rhetoric, who are violent. And so when you label your political opponent as a terrorist and a threat to democracy, then what is the outpouring or the manifestation of people who are terrorists and threats to democracy? Yeah. And so when you continually label somebody that, then you incite this sort of action that is carried out against people who are conservatives or Republicans, and in this case, Donald Trump. That is unacceptable coming from the left. Anybody who's on the right who is just saying hateful and mean things about individuals without just criticizing their policy or having a good articulated argument for why they're disagreeing with the policy needs to severely re-examine what they're saying, because we can't have this hateful rhetoric going back and forth because it has consequences. But the left will say this all day long and get a pass on it because the media is in bed with the left, unfortunately. And they are continually saying things like Donald Trump is a threat to democracy, which gives rise in an outpouring to actions that you see that are occurring against him. And so when the left has no argument against a particular issue, they will then label the other person or other side as a certain thing like a bigot or a racist or something else, and then say, I'm not going to debate this person as a result of them being a bigot or a racist. And you even see this in North Carolina right now. I mean, Josh Stein, who is running for governor against the Republican nominee, Mark Robinson, has said he is not going to debate Mark Robinson just because he thinks that he is a bigot and he doesn't want to legitimize his verbiage or his words. And so that is just what the left will do. They'll run from the fight. They'll run from the argument. They won't stand and have a debate on any sort of these principles, because they know that when it gets drilled down to the foundation of their worldview, there is no foundation. There is no foundation of absolute truth. And this outpouring of rhetoric that they have is unfortunately something that just spews out of an anger as opposed to a foundation.
So how do you see this assassination attempt impacting the election? Is it going to have an impact, and will it work to Trump's advantage, or how do you see it playing out?
Well, in my opinion, it would certainly have an advantage to President Trump because it humanizes him. It just shows the fact that he is a human like you and me. And the way that they have come after him from the lawfare standpoint, from lawsuits in civil court, from trying to impeach him multiple times, from phony investigations, to then just going and trying to have an attempt on his life, multiple attempts on his life, shows that they are genuinely concerned about him. You know, if Donald Trump were down 15 points in the polls, I doubt you'd see such an outpouring of hatred towards him. However, this is a neck and neck campaign, and they realize that if they don't get this opportunity to try and drastically change the foundation of the United States of America, then they will be stunted from doing it for a very long time, because they know the things that Donald Trump did. They saw him appoint 3 good justices to the Supreme Court. They know if he gets in again, he's going to do more appointments to the Supreme Court if there becomes a vacancy there. He's also going to have an outpouring of positive policies, things that I think thrust the family and the church back into the spotlight over the overarching power of the state. So I believe that this will ultimately help President Trump, but I pray that it stops happening. We don't need this sort of spike in the news cycle about these attacks against him in order to win this. We can win this on our own merit and on our own arguments if we articulate it well. And it's highly unfortunate that we even have to have this discussion right now as to whether or not 2 attempts on the former president's life are going to give him an edge in the presidential election.
Well, yeah, that's kind of sad that is even a concern. But well, Luke, you're a communications expert, political expert. How good of a job is the Trump campaign doing right now in terms of getting its message out? It seems like they're being drowned out, by the mainstream media. And man, I'm getting barraged in my own emails from the Kamala Harris campaign. I'm like, why are they wasting money on me? There's no way I would ever vote for her. But, Trump just doesn't, my perspective, it doesn't seem like he's really talking about policy that much. And am I wrong on that?
I hope they keep wasting their money on you, Richard, because if their targeting is off that much, it gives me hope that we have a better leg up in this election coming up. The thing that the Trump campaign has been trying to drive home, and rightly so, and it took a little bit after the switcheroo between Joe Biden and Kamala Harris for them to start analyzing this, because you also have to think, like, they spent years and years that drilling down on Joe Biden's votes and his policy and his rhetoric and attacking him, and they had to do a complete different operation on 180 and trying to focus on Kamala Harris. And what they've honed down on, I think, is going to be highly consequential in the last few months or weeks of this debate leading up to the election day, is that she has failed, weak, and dangerously liberal. We know all the things that she said she would do if she were elected president. She had to run so far to the left of her Democrat Party in 2020 trying to get the nomination against Joe Biden that she earned a whopping 3% from the Democrat base. Her ideas are not popular even with moderates in the Democrat Party. So if those issues can be drawn out and defined, then I believe it gives Republicans a leg up. things about saying that she's going to completely get rid of gas-powered vehicles over the span of a few years, saying that we need to reduce red meat consumption, transitioning energy workers into the jobs of the future, whatever that means, saying these radical things like she's going to impose a Green New Deal. She said that if she were elected president, she would pass a Green New Deal. She ran so far to the left that she is now having to change every aspect of her policy and then adopt policies from the Trump campaign. You know, she was accused of copying and pasting Joe Biden's policies from his website, which literally in the source code we found out that she did the other day. She's probably going to be found out from copying and pasting policies from Donald Trump's website onto her website, and she's almost got a MAGA hat on. Joe Biden's already got a MAGA hat on. So as we start to move closer to the election day, I believe that the policies of Kamala Harris are going to be drawn out. But you're right, Richard, that in the media, which was never going to be on Donald Trump's side, they refused to accurately cover the things that Kamala has stood for in the past. Their enthusiasm waned so drastically for Joe Biden towards the end that they kind of became a little lackadaisical about their coverage of Joe Biden. Normally, they're supposed to be propping him up, but they became so disillusioned with his performance, how he was doing in the polls, how he was doing on stage, that they just stopped analyzing him and stopped giving him favorable coverage, which gave the Trump campaign a leg up. And we kind of got used to that for a little while. And now we're seeing the left or the media come home to the left again and start propping up their preferred candidate as somebody who would take on a Republican candidate.
Yeah, well, one of the questions seems to me that ought to be put to Kamala Harris continuously, even if rhetorically, like even if she's not available to answer, is if you were going to do it, why haven't you? If you're going to lower prices, why haven't you? If you're going to fix the border, why haven't you? If you're going to stand up for America's military, why haven't you? You know, you've had 4 years to do it, and that's long enough. But what about hitting Kamala's, you know, she's got some pretty crazy things that she endorsed in the debate and wasn't challenged on, like modifying the child tax credit. She's going to increase it, but the problem with it is that it's a one-time credit. Whereas right now you get to claim the credit every year on your taxes. It's going to be a huge net loss to American families. Or this whole thing about taxing unrealized gain. People have no idea the tax bill that's going to generate, but it's going to be devastating. Like when you go to sell your home and, you make $50,000 in appreciation, you're taxed before you even sell it under her plan. Am I understanding this correctly?
That's exactly right. And then she tried to kind of run away from those policies a little bit. But I guarantee you, if she were elected president, she would be bringing them back up again, because the things that aren't poll tested very well, they will try to run away from. Taxing unrealized gains, you realize how ridiculous that is? You are not benefiting from them. You have the potential to lose them at any given point. It allows or it stops reinvestment of those into different aspects of a business. And then that forces employees who are working in that business to potentially lose their jobs, and then the business doesn't grow at a high rate, so the job numbers would drop exponentially. She said she would get rid of the Trump tax cuts on day one, another day one promise of hers that apparently her day one was 3.5, 4 years ago. She's not delivered on, but she said on day one of her administration, she would be the one that would come in and get rid of the Trump tax cuts. Economically, none of her policies make sense. And she was not directly challenged on these under the debate moderators, who were essentially all just debating against Donald Trump. And that is very sick and sad, because the economic outpouring from the United States, the economic welfare of the United States, is also directly tied to our national security. Our standing, our foothold in the world is not going to be as strong as it has been if we move further in the direction of these policies. And the United States will cease to be the greatest nation on earth if we stop having such an outpouring of our economic prosperity that the American dream just becomes an American nightmare.
Well, Luke, I wanted to mention something else while I've got you here, and that is how is Trump polling amongst his, in 2020, the very highest percentage that voted of any group in favor of Donald Trump were SageCons, as George Barna likes to call us, or engaged conservative Christian voters, politically engaged conservative Christian voters. I think it was somewhere over 90% voted for Trump. How is he doing this time around amongst evangelical conservative Christian voters?
I think he's doing just as well, and that means that the responsibility lies upon us as evangelical voters to turn out and vote, because if we got our act together, we could be the greatest driving force of politics, not in the nation, on the face of the planet. If evangelical Christians actually got up off of their couches and turned out to vote and swamped the whole system, we would be in charge of this country. All of the problems that we discuss on a daily basis because the Democrats have a stronghold in particular areas, if we flooded them with voters and gave Republican representatives in the House of Representatives and in these state legislatures and in the White House and across the nation, do you realize the kind of impact that we would have? We would be absolutely unstoppable. That's the vision that we should be having for ourselves right now. The fact is that we as a group could come together and change the direction of the world. But too many people have refused to get involved. They have refused to even register to vote, refused to make their voices heard or known. And as a result, not only have we lost policy battles on the face of the federal government and the state government, but we have not fulfilled the entire mandate that was given to us by Jesus. And so I think that we have to focus our efforts on turning out this important, crucial voting block in the elections. Look no further than the special election that we had in Georgia just a few years ago. Would have thrown control of the control of the Senate to the Republicans if we had turned out and voted a Republican into office. And yet the Christians that turned out to vote did not turn out enough. And that margin of error between the 2020 election and the 2022 elections were so small that if the people who had turned out as Christians in 2022 had done it in 2020, then we would have won and won control of the Senate and had vastly different policies. Perhaps that description was a little confusing, but the bottom line is this: if our margin increases just slightly, we could be completely unstoppable.
Yeah, that ought to be encouraging. Well, what do you think needs to be done to turn out the Christian vote?
Well, we have to identify the people who stand in evangelical churches or who turn out to go and attend in these churches, who say that they are Christians, and we have to make sure that they are registered. We also have to make sure that they are informed. And you highlighted something that the ministry there, the C3, I believe, or C4, is doing related to informing Christians on the different stances that political candidates take on issues, or at least that parties take on issues. Doing things like that and supporting ministries and organizations that are informing people about where political candidates stand is going to be crucial. And it requires an outpouring of resources and an outpouring of volunteerism to make sure that we continue driving in this direction, because without it, the left is very, very well funded. And we may not ever get to a point where we are completely outpacing them when it comes financially, but we could do it with the enthusiasm we have because we know our foundation goes back to our worldview.
Well, yeah, and Luke, I'm interested also in your perspective on millennial and Gen Z voters today, and because I'm beginning to hear the Bible refers to the rustling sound in the mulberry trees. I'm starting to hear sounds of revival in this country, and we're seeing evidence of it all over the place. Do you think that it is far enough along at this point to have any consequences politically, or should we still expect Gen Z and millennials to vote Democrat in the same percentages as they did 2 and 4 years ago?
Well, first of all, I will also reiterate that when it comes to Gen Z and millennial voters, I believe that in the last midterm elections, they split for the Democrats in the ballpark of 65%. And then Republicans in that field turned out in the ballpark of 25%, and the rest were split up among the other parties and candidates that were there. And so, unfortunately, the direction is going with the Democrats and progressives. And I believe it goes back to the foundations of the education system that we have been talking about. But what's also curious about that is that percentage that turned out to vote was only around 30% of the people who were able to vote in the midterm elections. There is untapped resources in voter turnout that we have to be engaged and directed towards. I believe that we have to win the message with Gen Zs and millennials. It's one of the reasons why I do what I do. I didn't see a lot of people who were doing this sort of thing. I don't even necessarily know what you would call it right now. My wife calls it a hobby when I'm going out and speaking, and maybe she's right on that. But like people like Charlie Kirk, who have a passion and an enthusiasm for the next generation of Americans, and who target directly with these arguments and go into the fire onto the college campuses and have debates and arguments with college students and try to present to them that the worldview that they have been basically issued like a textbook in their college classes may not hold as much water as they think that it does. So by driving the argument and debate down to these students and to these millennials and Gen Zers, we are hopefully going to be able to win hearts and minds.
Absolutely. Well, so just sort of my questions are a little bit random right now, but I just want to pick your brains here. What do you think of Trump's vice presidential choice? I know it's a done deal, of course, has been for quite a while, but is JD Vance a liability or an asset, politically speaking? I think he's a strong U.S. senator and probably will be right on most issues, but politically, is it working out for him?
I think he's an asset, and I think one of the greatest things he brings to the table is his personal story and struggle in middle America. These voters in basically flyover country really aspire to be like JD Vance and look up to him. His mother was deeply drawn in by a drug addiction. He grew up in a lot of poverty. He looked around him and saw some of the forgotten men and women of America that Donald Trump had tapped into. And so I believe that this story of success in the face of absolute peril and overcoming the odds to get to where he is today is something that really appeals to voters that are crucial for turnout in the 2024 election. That story, coupled with the policies that I believe he's already demonstrated in the United States Senate, are something that should help the campaign close this deal and bring it home. And I'll also say that a lot of the people who are being considered for vice president are going to find themselves in a future Trump administration in different policy positions in cabinets, in the administration. And I think that once we bring everybody under this one big tent in the Republican Party, we have an enormous amount of talent. We saw it manifested in the primary elections. And now that we have come together as one unit, I believe it can be diversified over a vast swath of the federal government and utilized to our advantage.
Absolutely. Well, one more question for you with the couple minutes we have left, Luke, is election integrity. Are we in the same place we were in 2020? And if not, are things better now or worse on that issue?
We have made significant progress in a lot of areas, but it is crucial that we do things like pass the SAVE Act before we get to this upcoming election. And I believe that the House of Representatives has probably voted on it by now. I'm not sure what the outcome is, but here's the reason why I think it's important to pass the SAVE Act tied in with the CR. I hate a CR, which is a continuing resolution. It's basically Washington speak for Congress failed to do its job and pass a budget. And so we're going to kick the can down the road a little bit. I am against CRs as much as the next patriot. However, because the SAVE Act is attached to it, and because it moves the goalpost down the line into March of 2025, where a hopeful Trump administration would be in charge of signing into legislation the budget for that year, for the next period of time. That's why I hope that we're able to move the SAVE Act and the CR through the House of Representatives today. Because if we don't do that, if we don't have secure elections, then we do not have a republic. And that is extremely concerning to me, that we can't pass something as basic as saying that United States citizens should vote in federal elections and non-citizens cannot vote in federal elections. The fact that we're having to have this debate with the Democrats is a very evident representation of why they want to not pass legislation relating to it, because it's their future political base. They are creating their own constituency to radically change the fabric of the United States of America. And if we stop them from doing that, then we have stopped and foiled their plan for the foreseeable future. They want as many people coming across our southern border as possible because they know that they will then go and sign and register them to vote, as opposed to us who are sitting in the Republican Party who can't even go and get all of our base registered to vote. So that's essential to making sure that we have secure and safe elections moving forward.
Yeah, so the SAVE Act, it's pending right now?
It either has passed the House as of right now or will be voted on this evening.
All right. Well, man, that's awesome, Luke. Thank you for sharing that with our viewers. How can people, know like when you're going to be speaking somewhere, or how can they support, your work and that sort of thing? Do you have a website or anything you'd like to share?
You can go to lukeball.org. It will drive to my Facebook page where I post all of the updates related to interviews or speaking engagements. You can follow me on social media. Just search Luke Ball, and normally I'm at Luke T. Ball.
All right. Well, Luke, thanks for coming on the show. Really appreciate the insights. It's been educational. And folks, be sure to check out Luke's website at lukeball.org. And also want to just remind everybody as we're signing off here about the Ministers Conference coming up September 30th through the 4th. You can register on the website at awmi.net for that, and be watching for announcements about Charlie Kirk coming on October 18th. Mark your calendars for that. And then again, Andrew's Final Gospel Truth Conference in Dallas, October 31st through November 2nd. Thank you so much for watching Truth and Liberty. We will see you next time.
Thank you for joining today's Truth and Liberty livecast. You can watch today's and past livecasts in our archives at truthandliberty.net. Our goal is to educate Christians and connect them with resources and organizations to help them impact their sphere of influence. You can help us accomplish this by making a donation at truthandliberty.net/donate. Join us next time for more Truth and Liberty.